In the last months of World War II, the people of the world went from one shocking discovery to another as Allied forces pressed into Germany from west and east. On January 27, 1945, Soviet forces liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau in southwestern Poland. Though several reports from both underground movements and escapees themselves were known at the highest levels of the Allied governments, seeing the camp and hearing about what happened there made it dawn on the people in the US, USSR, and Great Britain just how evil the Nazi regime was. A few weeks later, British forces liberated the unbelievably crowded and filthy Bergen-Belsen camp north of Hanover, and the Americans liberated the Dachau camp near Munich, the first camp established by the Nazis. Hundreds of large and small other camps were liberated throughout Europe. One of the many things that shocked the liberators and the Allied public was the presence of female guards, known in German as Aufseherin, female overseer. They were doubly shocked when the Red Army liberated the Ravensbrück camp north of Berlin on April 30th, 1945. Why the shock? Because Ravensbrück was a camp for women, the largest of many when sub-camps and segregated areas of other camps are considered. 9 sub-camps in the Großrosen camp system were for women only, and primarily staffed by women. The camp at Brindlitz, Oskar Schindler's hometown, which we see in the movie, was populated and staffed by women for most of the war. In the last days of the war, thousands of women brought in on the infamous death marches were dumped in other camps, like Bergen-Belsen, and essentially left to fend for themselves. One of them was Anne Frank. The Nazis established their first concentration camp at Dachau, just outside Munich soon after they took power in early 1933. Aside from housing so-called enemies of the state, Dachau was purposefully set up to be a training ground for SS camp personnel, and the system of extreme cruelty that was put in place. Most of the extermination camp commandants and many others were trained at Dachau, where brutality was encouraged. As the jails and camps filled up in the first years of the Nazi regime, more and more camps were built or converted from existing buildings. One of the next camps to be opened after Dachau was Lichtenberg, where an old Renaissance castle hid horrors inside its walls. Lichtenberg was a man's camp until 1937, when the influx of women made finding more space for them necessary. Lichtenberg was closed in 1939, and a munitions depot was created because the new and larger Ravensbrück camp for women was opened in 1939. The vast majority of SS Aufseherinnen passed through Ravensbrück before they were assigned to other camps. Of course, some women were true believers in the Nazi cause and ideology, and probably most held those feelings to one extent or another. But a large number of the women trained there, like the most known of the women guards, Irma Gräse, needed work. When the war was over and the paltry few Aufseherinnen who were brought to justice out of the 3,500 or so known to be in the Overseer Corps were brought to trial, one of the other things that shocked the world was that aside from the brutality shown by many of these women, many of them weren't all that invested in Nazi ideology. Of course, that ideology had seeped its way into the hearts of most of them, to one degree or another, but many, when asked why they volunteered for the Aufseherin, said that they had needed a steady job. Many of these women were from poor or broken families and were poorly educated. A job with the SS gave prestige and, sadly, steady work. At Ravensbrück, the women learned how to treat other women like animals, and cruelty, whether it was the detached cruelty of calmly sending someone to their death or beating them to death with a whip or their boots, was a prized quality. The women prisoners learned very quickly that women could be just as violent and inhumane as men. Here are the stories of some of them. Erika Bergman, the beast in human skin, or Bestie in Menschenhaut. Not much is known about her early life, but we can make a few assumptions. She was born in Berlin in 1915, meaning she was a small child but old enough to remember the post-World War I hyperinflation and hunger stalking German streets in the early 1920s. Most people outside Germany know Berlin in the 1920s as a hotbed of cosmopolitan culture, jazz, and sexual experimentation. But for most Berliners, life was hard, exceedingly hard, and it didn't get easier in the first years of the 1930s either. More than likely, Bergman saw things begin to improve economically when Hitler took over, and, like so many other Germans, found in Hitler's speeches and movement someone to blame for their problems and the problems of Germany: the Jews and the Communists. Bergman arrived at Ravensbrück in 1943 for her training. She was then sent to a subcamp of Ravensbrück, the Gentin labor camp. At Gentin, Bergman developed her reputation for cruelty. One day, Bergman spotted a young Roma woman who was, in Bergman's opinion, working too slowly. So she set her guard dog on the prisoner, tearing her lower torso apart, but not immediately killing her. The woman lost consciousness and was left lying on the ground. When other women moved forward to help the bloody woman, Bergman forbade them from doing so and made them all stand outside for hours while the woman died. Quite a number of other accounts record Bergman setting her dog on other prisoners, again Roma women, who Bergman especially hated. In 1945, Bergman's dog tore into a Polish prisoner. The woman was forced to continue her work without treatment. Bergman's motto was "She who is a prisoner is not a person." When Bergman's male counterparts neglected to have prisoners harvest a small vegetable garden and the crop rotted, Bergman blamed the prisoners and beat them with her dog's leash, in the face. Bergman was one of many female and male guards to make use of another extremely cruel punishment. An elderly woman was made to stand in the cold air of German winter for hours, while Bergman doused her with cold water from a hose. The woman died. Others were kicked and beaten to death. After the war, Bergman managed to hide her identity in the new East Germany, but was eventually discovered in 1955. She was sent to one of the most notorious women's prisons in Germany and was ultimately sentenced to life. She died in prison in 1991. Maria Mandl. Maria Mandl's name is etched in infamy, though her story is still not as widely known as it should be. Born in Austria, like an unsettling number of high-ranking Nazis, she rose to become one of the most feared women in the SS system. After the 1938 Anschluss, the unification of Austria with Nazi Germany, Mandl moved to Munich and joined the SS Aufseherin Corps, starting out at Lichtenberg, one of the early concentration camps in Saxony. The camp mostly held men, but it served as a training ground in brutality for Mandl, who quickly absorbed the lessons handed down from notorious figures like Theodor Eicke, the first commandant of Dachau and architect of the entire camp system. From there, Mandl was transferred to Ravensbrück, where she climbed the ranks swiftly after officially joining the Nazi Party. Holding the title of Oberaufseherin, chief female overseer, she controlled assignments, doled out punishments, and orchestrated violence either through others or directly herself. Her efficiency earned her a promotion in October 1942 to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where she took command of all the female guards. She supervised infamous figures like Irma Grese and personally elevated her to head of the Hungarian women's section in 1944. Most of the mass killings at Auschwitz occurred between 1942 and 1944, and Mandl was central to that machinery of death. Her signature appeared on the rosters of inmates selected for extermination, lists she often helped compile. Mandl added a chilling layer of cruelty to camp life by forming a band composed of prisoners. It played during roll calls, hangings, shootings, and selections, supposedly to keep people calm. But everyone knew, when the band played, death followed. Among her many crimes, she tore infants from their mothers and threw them into trucks bound for the gas chambers. She beat children to death in front of their parents, then assaulted the parents too, sometimes aiming specifically to knock out their teeth. When the exterminations at Auschwitz slowed, Mandl was reassigned to Dachau. As Allied forces closed in, she fled into the Bavarian Alps, but was captured by US troops. She was extradited to Poland, tried for crimes against humanity, and executed by hanging on January 24, 1948. Hermina Brownsteiner. The case of Hermina Brownsteiner, later known as Hermina Brownsteiner-Ryan, is one of the more surreal Nazi post-war stories. She lived out her final years as an American housewife, dying in 1999. Ryan came from her American husband, whom she married in 1958. By the time she was discovered living in Queens, New York in 1964, she was seen by her neighbors as a polite, clean, friendly woman. No one knew she had once been dubbed the stomping mare at Majdanek for her fondness for kicking inmates to death. After World War II, she was held in detention centers until 1947, then extradited to Austria in 1949. There, she faced trial and was convicted, not for mass murder, but for the milder charge of crimes against human dignity. She was sentenced to 3 years and served only a few months, thanks to credit for time already spent in German custody. The more serious charges of crimes against humanity couldn't stick. Majdanek had few survivors, and most either disappeared into post-war chaos or avoided reliving the trauma. By 1959, she had emigrated to Canada with her husband, Russell Ryan, then moved to the US and gained American citizenship in 1963. It wasn't until famed Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, while meeting with Majdanek survivors in Israel, received leads that eventually brought a reporter from the New York Times to her doorstep in Queens. When the young journalist showed up, Brownsteiner immediately realized the jig was up. Her husband insisted my wife wouldn't hurt a fly. He thought she had worked in a medical unit. He was dead wrong. It took 5 years of legal battles to revoke her US citizenship, but eventually, the unassuming Queens housewife was extradited to West Germany, tried, and convicted of crimes against humanity. The charges including throwing children into gas vans and whipping women to death. She was sentenced to life in 1981, but was released in 1996 for Hertha Oberhäuser. Few war criminals better illustrate post-war injustice than Hertha Oberhäuser. She was the only woman tried at the so-called doctor's trial at Nuremberg in 1946-47, a special tribunal focused on SS medical personnel and their atrocities. Oberhäuser had worked at Ravensbrück as a physician under SS surgeon Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's own doctor. She wasn't there to heal anyone. She was there to experiment on human beings, using victims as disposable test subjects in nightmarish procedures. Among the horrors she inflicted, applying caustic substances to open wounds to study infection spread, harvesting organs from the dying or dead, and attempting bone transplants, often without any anesthesia. Like many of her SS colleagues, she seemed to relish the suffering. When prisoners begged for water, she gave them vinegar. Despite overwhelming evidence, Oberhäuser was sentenced to just 20 years. Even that was short-lived. In 1951, amid pressure in West Germany to reduce sentences for Nazi officials, her term was commuted. She was released after serving just 1 year for good behavior. Astonishingly, she resumed her medical career after her release. Records were lost, and no one seemed to check her background thoroughly. For 6 years, she practiced medicine near Kiel on the North Sea coast before her license was finally revoked. She died quietly in a retirement home in 1978. Thank you for watching today.